morning. Thanks for joining us again this week.
Morning, everybody.
We are continuing our conversation kind of based around the 10 values for the modern family that Erin Waffen outlines in her book, More Than Words. And I said at the very beginning that as I read this book, like just about every theological or parenting book or, I read some of it and I go, I don't agree with that. And so this chapter in particular was a real struggle for me. She talks this chapter, and this morning we're going to talk about nonviolence, which is a value that I think we all agree. We don't want our children to be violent. We all sit in horror when we see violence and experience violence, and there's not a one of us that's okay with our kid beating up another kid at school, regardless of the situation. And so it is a value that every family has.
I also, same thing as with Pastor Aimee, had some difficulties with but it's her opinion, and that's why she's the author. She wrote the book, I didn't, and so, but I was the same way. Some of the things I really agree with, and other things, they're not right for me or not right for my beliefs.
So I would say, even if you don't have the book, I would encourage you to do just what Roger and I did, is really wrestle with this topic. You don't have to land the same place as anybody else, really. And you and your spouse could land different places. And so the job as parents then is to come to a meeting place on how do we want to apply this to our family? You come at this way and I come at this way, but what do we want for our children in our home? And so I think it could be a really good conversation starter.
Yeah. And I did learn a lot. And I went down, in my personal studies, and we'll get into this, but I went down some, you might call them rabbit holes or whatever, but some areas where it made me really think and contemplate some different thinking and, reaffirm my personal theology and what I believe. And so that's good. That's a good part of it.
Right. Yeah, I never want to find myself only reading things that I agree with, because we end up in an echo chamber that just, we just end up in the cycle where we're never challenged. And that's where we learn and grow, is when we read someone else's take on things and go, first reaction is no. And second reaction is, okay, well, let me at least hear her out.
Right.
And I may still say no, but at least I understand where she's coming from. So one of the things she talks about right from the beginning, which I think is a good kind of foundation for the conversation, is peace versus nonviolence. It's kind of like when we talked about love versus compassion. That love is a nice abstract idea that we slap on a lot of stuff. And, we've all made the joke about every pageant queen says that she just wants world peace, because it's like this abstract, easy Hallmark thing. But she says that peace is the biblical, global, and or Hallmark Christmas card sense is a state of being. So peace is a state of being. But nonviolence is a way of being, a practice, an activity, a philosophy, an avenue by which peace may be attained. In other words, if peace is the desired state of being, then nonviolence is an intentional set of practices by which you might arrive there. So I know that was a good way to kind of set the stage that there is a difference between peace as an abstract and nonviolence as a reality.
Yes, and then she kind of goes into an area this is an area that we both kind of, Aimee and I, we had a hard time with. And this is where you get into personal feeling, personal theology, and things like that. But she goes into the more of atonement theory. And so many of us grew up in a time period, because it's more of a modern theological theory of atonement. And by the way, if you go to a seminary, Pastor Aimee's been to seminary, I haven't. I just read this stuff on the internet and go through the books. So, but there's like 8 major theories of atonement that you'll get in seminary, and then there's sub-theories even beyond that. But I get this. So they're theories, and so people get hung up on one is correct and this is the only way you can believe. But they are theories. They are just points of philosophy and theology that over the ages have come up in discussion. Well, so I'm going to speak for me personally, so I will give you my personal value. All of those thoughts, philosophies, all have some validity within either one of them. To say that one is correct, to me, that's wrong in and of itself. To say that I subscribe to only theory number 8 of the atonement theories, which would be, theory number 8 is the most recent, and that would be your penal substitution. Okay, and so I am not not that one, or the necessary satisfaction, and you can go through all of these. So, but each one has a valid point, and so, you kind of have to read those and or just think about where things are. So here's where I'm going to go with this. Here's Roger's. This is not Pastor Aimee's. This is not even the author's. But so first, I want to read Romans 3:25 and 26. So Romans 3:25 and 26 says this: God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus Christ. So where the author went is a part of modern theology is the Passion of the Christ, that God is pouring out his wrath on Jesus as he goes to the cross and on the cross. That is not my atonement theology. My atonement theology, personally, is look at the worldview of the time. The torture, the beatings that Jesus was put through he was an enemy of the state. He was an enemy of the Jewish people at that point and the Romans. And he was a blameless man who was treated like a common criminal would be at that time period and crucified. The beatings that he went through are meant to show us what he went through in his love for us, but they were not the wrath of God. The wrath of God was atoned for just by the blood sacrifice of Jesus. That's my personal theology.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I hear some of what she's saying is when we put so much into that sacrifice as God's wrath, then we miss maybe the big picture. And so I agree, because it was terrible, it was horrible, but in the context of that day, it was also the appropriate punishment for the crimes of that day.
In our passage in Romans gives us, that sacrifice enables God to, one, justify sinful people around us, because it allows sinful people to still live, because the sacrifice of Jesus has taken care of that. And then, but God can still be just. He's provided the way.
Yeah.
He's still a just God.
Yeah. Good. And I think it could be connected, excuse me for going there, when we talk about the death penalty, which is something we're all going to land probably different places on. But one of the things she talks about is it's even beyond, do we have a right to take a life? She doesn't even, I don't think, goes into that argument as far as from a scriptural basis. But what she talks about as Christians, we're for mercy, not because the criminal came to know Jesus. And she talks about someone who was on death row, who changed her life and became a chaplain and went to seminary and started doing all these wonderful things. And Christians from the progressive all the way to the very conservative all banded together in trying to fight for this woman's life, to be released from death penalty. And the point that this author's making is, just because she came to know Jesus doesn't mean that she's any more worthy of not being put to death than everyone else. And she says that look at the most hardened, heinous, unrepentant criminals in the systems. The one whose crimes keep us up at night. The ones who show no remorse. The ones who did not become chaplains after a come to Jesus moment. For them, assume there's no shred of worthiness that might merit sparing their lives. What then about their inerrant worth as a child of God? Is that not enough? Is that dim light of createdness, the one that bears the image of the holy, not reason enough to stop this barbaric practice once and for all? For many it is not, but for many criminal justice is about vengeance above all. And I think it does tie in, because I've heard the comparison about, but God put to death people that were awful in sacrificing children. Why can't we do the same today? And I think that is where some of that tension lies between, some of what the Old Testament, the New Testament, and how we do it. But I also can understand people's viewpoints on that. But I think it is hard for all of us. It's a hard pill to swallow when we look at some of the most notorious, awful people, especially when they do things to innocent people like children, and look at them as a child of God.
Mm-hmm.
That is really hard.
Right. But
No.
Jesus upended everything when he said, how many times do we forgive? 70 times 7.
Yes.
He took from the Old Testament and the violence that was there, and Cain killing Abel, and then Lamech down the road, and Lamech saying, just because I was injured, I'm going to avenge by killing 70 times 7. And then throughout, but Jesus says, no, it's about forgiving 70 times 7. So we have to think about it in Jesus terms.
Absolutely.
And I'm just going to throw as an aside, and once again, you can have your own viewpoint, but the Innocence Project. Look it up on the internet, read through it, read some of the stories about people who have been wrongfully convicted. We execute very few people a year, and what if one of those was wrongfully convicted? I would rather them spend their life in prison than the wrongful execution.
Yeah, that is it's a hot topic button, but I feel like it's a conversation, and it's going to come up in your home.
Mm-hmm.
Your child is at some point going to ask that, and I think it's important for us to be able to say, this is where we stand on this. This is one of the points that I do agree with the author, that is a child of God. At the end of the day, it is a child of God. It is a beloved child of God. And, Jesus has said over and over and over again, always choose the nonviolent path. Always. Even at his own demise. He chose that until he died.
Right.
And he chose, she points out that he could have done this. He could have done that. He could have slaughtered all those people. He could have, and he chose not to. And that is the example that we have. I'm trying to find that where he says that about, he could have, here he is. Throughout the Gospels, he calls down the powers of heaven to do everything from cast out demons to still a stormy sea. But he does not call down that power to destroy his captors. He rallied the masses everywhere he went, but he did not rally the troops to go to war against Pilate and the state. And he died instead. And it turned out to be the most powerful thing that anyone has ever done. Even in his own death, Jesus proclaimed that hope does not lie in any show of human force, but in God's transforming acts of mercy. And that's where I always land on things like death penalty.
Very good. So then she moves into some statements by the theologian Walter Wink, and he explores a way in which Jesus teaches. He calls it not just the principles of nonviolence, but he calls it the third way. And the third way moves beyond passive resistance, creating ways to assert authority. For instance, turning the other cheek, a biblical directive interpreted by many as allowing someone to hit you again, is really robbing the oppressor of the power to publicly humiliate you. Mm-hmm. And that's a great thing. When you think about the context of the time, that you were expected to stand up and take the challenge, and that you were expected to strike back, but instead you stood tall, you stood proud, and you just robbed them of that power to make you move to the next level.
Right.
You were in control of the situation.
Yeah, I do love this because it's so countercultural to what we do now. And he says the third way, in the English translation, that Greek word usually is interpreted as weakness. But beyond that surface meaning, it can be understood as to set against, to creatively turn the tables in a way that removes the oppressor's power without doing physical harm, that empowers the oppressed without the need for bloodshed or force. And then she says, if a person's robbed you of your clothing, which, is in the example of Jesus saying someone takes your cloak,
Right.
Well, clearly you would be naked. And well, in the ancient world of Jesus' ministry setting, the shame of nakedness is not on the person who's naked, but the one who sees the nakedness. So if you were to strip off your remaining undergarments and hand them over to a thief in a public square, it would be a funny way to really turn things around on the person who thinks they have power over you. Yeah. Which I thought was, it is countercultural, but I thought that was an interesting point about, and I think that's a great way to view when Jesus says those kind of things. He's speaking from that context that you're turning the tables on that person and making the oppressor now, humiliated,
right,
in a nonviolent way.
Yeah, it's a non-defiant act of defiance.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So she goes into like all of her chapters. She talks about how we can practice this in community, how we can practice this in our home, and scripture, which we've talked some about, stories of scripture about that. So let's talk a little bit about at home. How can we practice nonviolence at home? So in her home, as you probably gleaned, she takes a pretty hard stance on nonviolent living. And so she does things in her home that I think are worthy of mentioning, because I think as parents, we all feel the need to fit in with our culture and our society. And we sometimes adopt practices from other families that we spend a lot of time with, or that family allows their kids to do this and we feel this pressure to do that as well. Or our children pressure us to let them do certain things. And so we sometimes bend to that. And her family is clearly living very counterculturally. And I think that's to be really commended, that they believe this so strongly in this nonviolent practice as a practice that Jesus is expecting of them, that they have made very strong decisions as far as upbringing with their children that I think are worthy of consideration, even if you choose not to do them. I think they're worthy of consideration. So she talks about entertainment, which I think a lot of us do. Mentioning what Roger said, is just shielding children from things like bombings and police shootings and dead people, all that kind of violent imagery, which I think a lot of us kind of agree. Yes, yeah. That's inappropriate. And I would say that also goes into video games, because a lot of the video games are shoot 'em up games, and that's an even harder stance to take, I think, especially if you have tweens or teens. That's a harder thing to do. She goes into language, talking back to the whole throwing yourself out the window. They don't say things like killing it, like I killed it. Right. I aced that speech. I killed it. Yeah. And I thought that was it's something that I never really thought about. Yeah. So.
Yeah, anytime or even just they made me so angry, you just kill them. Just you're not going to, but it's still that.
It's like a flippant remark. Yeah. Of course, no hitting of siblings, which I think we all agree. We can't beat up our siblings. But she also says they don't spank their children. They don't believe in corporal punishment. They tie it to hitting, and you can make that stance however you want on that. And then she talks about learning history together, and this is where I feel like she contradicted herself quite a bit.
Me too.
But she talks about how she wants her children to really understand our violent past, especially as a country and as Christians. I mean, we sometimes avoid the whole what's the word I'm thinking of? The Crusades. Right. We ignore the whole Crusades as part of our history because it's so violent and wrong, and we don't want to acknowledge it. But so she makes a point that if we don't teach children and teenagers that, then history could repeat itself. And she wants them to be exposed by how violent past was. But where I get hung up is she doesn't think that the Passion of the Christ should have been depicted as accurately as it did. And she almost calls it torture porn. Yeah. So I felt that was a contradiction.
Yeah. Because yes, it is a biblical narrative, but it that also is a historical point. Exactly. And so it is just as much a part of history as it is part of the biblical narrative and the biblical story of salvation. Yeah. So. Yeah, I kind of raised my eyebrows on that, and would love to ask her where's the difference here. Yeah. And I think it plays back into her. She struggles with the theory of atonement, and so for her it is torture porn. Yeah. And I think for many of us who believe that is part of our salvation and part of the story, but it's history. It's still history, and it's So I think it's part of the story. But I don't enjoy that movie. It is not. It's not part of my. Like I said, I can understand it, but that's not the part of the cross that I choose to dwell on. Right. And I think a lot of us choose to dwell more on the grace side and ultimately what happened than the crucifixion side.
Right. And I do, I think what we can take from what she says is that part of the story of the crucifixion is obviously an important part of our story. It is part of history, but it's not the end-all, be-all of who God is and who Jesus is. And if we just get hung up on that one thing, and every Sunday that's all we teach, and we're just putting that fear into our children all the time of this violent death for you, then we miss the grace and love in all the stories that he shows us, and the ways that we should be living. And so there has to be a balance there, I think, in not shielding them. But I still wouldn't teach a 3-year-old crucifixion.
Right.
Because it's just not developmental. You wouldn't expose them to any other violent thing, and that is still a violent story. And then she talks about toys, and I know many of you have taken the stance that guns are not toys. We don't play guns. And so I think that a lot of parents have already taken that stance. But she's not like, I have worked with parents that are almost disgusted if they walk in and their child has their finger like this.
Right.
And really take a really hard stance. But she says, I don't have a fit if they play with them at a kid's house.
Right.
And if they get one as a gift, I'm going to let them play with it a little while, and then it's just going to disappear. And so I appreciate the fact that she's not so hard on that, that her child is in this weird situation. And then she talks about just prayers for peace are part of their family prayer time. Not just the thoughts and prayers kind of peace, but praying for bullies. And praying for people who hurt us, and praying for, those are hard people for us to pray for. But going back to her death penalty conversation, is they're still children of God.
Right. Yeah.
So, so those are some of the things that she talks about her own family does. So it would be interesting to hear what you and your spouse have decided in your own home. What things have you done in your home that would be considered non-violent? As a church community, to say, this is where we stand on this. And she talks about curriculum quite a bit, which I have not seen it too much, at least in recent years, about children's curriculum especially, and the imagery that they put forward. I feel like curriculum writers have gotten a lot better about what kind of imagery are we exposing our children to, but there is some rewriting that occasionally needs to happen. So, but to make sure it's developmentally appropriate. Because I think sometimes people feel like, but it's scriptural, so all children should learn it.
Right.
They're still developmentally, if they're too immature for a rated R movie, they're too immature for some of the violent stories of Scripture. And there's a time and place for it. And we expose them to more and more depths of those stories the older they get. She kind of goes into Scripture, which we've touched on again, but it kind of goes back to abundance. The story of abundance about, from the very first episode of Scripture is Abel, and the murder of Abel. And again, it's rooted, like we mentioned a couple weeks ago, it's rooted again in Cain not thinking there was enough. And he had to take him out. And there's not enough land for us. There's not enough love from our parents. There's not enough whatever. And so this is how I'm responding, is through violence. And from our ancient faith narrative to modern day crimes, from the mugging on the street to global conflict over natural resources, scarcity and bloodshed are linked.
I guess we got to kind of, once again, ask those questions of you and each other of, in what ways has violence become an accepted part of life?
Right.
And how do we want to change that?
Yeah. And how do you as parents and family members, even if you're not a parent of children anymore, how can your family life be nonviolent? How can you, and I would say not only in what you're instilling in your children, but in your practice, because we've talked about, love is compassion and abundant living and living that out. So how can we practice nonviolence to the point that we want to make a difference, and not just within our own home? And I think FAST is one of those organizations that those who participate in FAST live that way, but they also want the community to be like them. And it's kind of this two-step. And so, but going back, the biggest platform you have is your home.
Absolutely.
Biggest platform. You can make be the most effective, most of us, unless we're Oprah, the most effective in changing the world by how we live and act and believe in our own community and our own family.
Challenge you too is when you hear a negative news story or something that has happened. For instance, here in the state of Florida, we've had several stand your ground cases. Think that scenario through and think, what could I have done differently that would have prevented that situation and would have how could I have played it in a non-violent manner? Yeah. Just walk through it. Just think, what could I have done differently that would have made this a better outcome, a better practice for being a Jesus follower.
Yeah. So I think the challenge is, okay, let me put apart this American culture. How should I respond according to what Jesus is teaching? You know, and it may not be applicable in this situation, but we have this wrestling match as Christians. We do. We have to wrestle all the time with the society and the culture in which we live in what Jesus is calling us to be. And he was a nonviolent person, and no one can argue that.
Right.
That he taught that over and over and over again, and we can't ignore that part of him and his teaching. But putting that in with how we live today is a challenge.
So, for being a subject we both thought was so hard, we've rambled on quite a long time.
Yeah, it was a hard chapter.
Yeah.
So if you're reading the book, we'd love to hear kind of your take on some of it. If you're not reading the book, that's okay too. We'd still love to hear your take on things and where you and your family have landed on that. I don't think there's really a wrong answer on some of this. So, yeah.
But thanks for a good discussion, Aimee. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you next week.